Thank you so much, Emily. Emily, prior to us coming, she said, I'm going to be introducing you. Would you like to look over the introduction? And I said, no, do your thing. And girl, you did your thing. That was probably the best introduction I have ever been presented with. Thank you so much. Thank you so much for that. I also would like to thank Lorde-ian University, the Department of Philosophy and Religious Studies for inviting me. It feels good to be in North Carolina. I was recently just in Idaho, and it was kind of cold. So it feels good to be here with humidity. So let's get started. So usually when people think about fighting against racial justice in particular, they have a view of what we call the resistance figure, hence looking up, talking about the view of a resistance figure. And usually when they think about a resistance figure, certain individuals come to mind. One individual is Martin Luther King Jr., and I'm currently teaching a class on King, so it'd be good to kind of explain at least the context of this picture. This was taken in, I believe, November of '61, I believe. And it was a continuation of the, I guess you could say, the sit-ins that were being done at the counters, something that the students in North Carolina began, and King participated in it, got arrested, civil disobedience. But we think about King kind of risking his life, going against the status quo, breaking certain kind of Jim Crow laws in order to fight against resistance. Then we also perhaps would think of Malcolm X, who is known for speaking truth to power. And then more recently, we have Kaepernick, which was able to use, I guess, his platform, his famous platform, to take a stand against police brutality. So these are at least some of the figures that come to mind when we think about resistance in the context of racial injustice. Now, they have certain things in common. Some of the features is that they're willing to risk their life, particularly we have seen that in the case of King and also in the case of Malcolm X. They're also willing to speak truth to power. So you're going to see this in the context of Malcolm X as well. Go against the status quo. We see this in the example of Kaepernick. They also engage in protest, something that we see very much in King, and also that's something that Kaepernick has become kind of famous for. These figures are also, some might say, charismatic, particularly when we're thinking about King and when we're thinking about Malcolm X. And usually when you think about charisma, men come to mind, unfortunately. So these men are men. And they're also usually have a large following, a large crowd, or a loud audience, a large audience. So these are some of the features that we think about a resistance figure will have. And there's certain implications if we think that this is what makes a resistance figure, right? So the first implication that we might think is that you must do something very particular with your rage, right? So you must either get on one knee, you must protest, you must get up in front of a podium and speak to people in the middle of Harlem. And so you might think that given these features of a resistance figure, it's not enough just to have rage. You must do something, do some kind of activity. And then another implication of these features is that one must think that these features are what we call kind of necessary and sufficient conditions. And so much so that you must have all of these features in order to be considered a resistance figure, okay? Now, what I want to do for the time that we have together is I want to challenge this view. And I want to challenge this view by giving a particular argument. So let me kind of briefly run through the argument that I'm going to give, and then I'm going to take my time and go through it, all right? So this is the argument that I want to kind of present with you today. So I guess we'll start with this premise. Those with what I call Lorde-ian rage, they break certain racial rules. And I'm going to explain to you exactly what I call Lorde-ian rage is all about. Such rule breaking challenges and threatens racial domination. I'll talk about how this is indeed the case. But racial domination requires no such rule breaking. So challenging and threatening racial domination projects is a form of resistance. There is rule breaking occurring through Lorde-ian rage. And therefore, I'm going to conclude that there are, therefore, resistance figures among us, all right? So there's a lot here, no worries. You're probably going to forget everything that I'm saying here, but I'm going to try to perhaps lead us to this last conclusion in the time that we have, all right? So this is how I'm going to try to proceed to kind of motivate this particular argument. So the first thing I want to talk about is exactly what I mean by Lorde-ian rage. And just to let you know, this work is the kind of the second to last chapter of a current book that I'm working on. And one of the things you notice about academics, when they come out with another book, they're thinking about another one already. All right, so that's kind of where I am. And so it's a book in which I'm giving an account of what I call Lorde-ian rage. So I'm going to briefly talk about that, since that's the kind of rage that I think break racial rules. And the second thing I'm going to go over is this thing called feeling rules, because I think that Lorde-ian rage breaks feeling rules, but it also does a little bit more. And then I'm going to provide a count of exactly what I mean by racial rules, since Lorde-ian rage breaks these rules. Then the fourth thing I'm going to do is talk about how that is indeed the case. How does this kind of rage break racial rules? And then finally, I'm going to give us some upshots and some things to think about before we leave here. Okay? So let me briefly explain to you exactly what am I referring to by Lorde-ian rage. And just to keep it in mind, I'm talking about a specific kind of rage. And so one of the things that I do in the first part of the book, I kind of talk about how there's different kinds of anger in the context of racial injustice. But there's a particular kind of rage that I motivate, and this is the rage that I'm referring to. All right. So let me kind of briefly give you an account of exactly what I mean by this kind of anger. And then if you have any more questions, we can talk about it in a Q&A, all right? So Lorde-ian rage, of what I call Lorde-ian rage, is named after poet and essayist Audre Lorde. And a lot of the account that I'm motivating is taken by particularly two of her essays found in her collection of essays called Sister Outsider. And most of the influence from the account comes from a famous essay called The Uses of Anger. So Lorde-ian rage, one of the things that Lorde-ian rage is directed at, as we see with all kinds of emotions usually have a target, something that is directed at, is that it is directed at racism, right? So it's not directly just directed at, let's just say, all white people or all people in dominant positions, right? It's a little bit more focused than that. It's specifically in response to racism. And Audre Lorde talks about how this kind of rage arises due to racism, racist attitudes, racist institutions. So it's directly directed at racism. She says in her work, my response to racism is anger, not laughter, not sadness, not indifference. She says that anger has eaten clefts into my living only when it has remained unspoken. All right, so it's directed towards racism. As far as what action tendency, because all emotions have an action tendency, it kind of, when we have this particular emotion or any kind of emotion, we have a tendency to participate in some kind of action. And so the question is, so when you have Lorde-ian rage, what is one more prone to do? And two things I want to say is the action tendency of this kind of rage is that one has a tendency to explore it. And Audre Lorde talks a lot about this in her work, that when you have this kind of rage at racism, one wants to figure out what kind of information can one get from it. And in her work, she talks about when you have this particular rage, you end up investigating, you end up finding out who your allies are, who your enemies are. You end up finding out more about yourself, more about your social location. And so the tendency is to explore it, to try to figure out what kind of information is this rage providing to you. Another action tendency of this particular rage is that one tends to metabolize it or to use it for some kind of good. So one does not just sit on it, but one is motivated to some type of extent or have a tendency to want to use it to do something positive in the world. And speaking of this positivity, Audre Lorde also says in her work, she says, everything can be used, hence the article, The Uses of Anger, everything can be used except that which is wasteful. And then she says, for those who have this particular anger, you're going to need to remember this, particularly when you are accused of destruction. All right, and we can talk a little bit more about this, about people have worries about anger being destructive and not being productive. But Audre Lorde wants to remind those who have this kind of rage that this is useful. Right? And wants to suggest that when one has this particular anger, one wants to use it for constructive ends. And what is the ends or the aim in which this rage is directed towards? Audre Lorde says it's the object of it. The aim is change, right? And she's very particular. I mean, she says, change sounds good, but she's very particular, and she talks about how it's a radical transformation of our world. right? A radical transformation of our world. So that's the aim. It's targeted towards racism, and they want to create a world in which racism does not exist. And that's a radical transformation of our world. And then last but not least, there is a particular perspective that informs the rage. And the perspective that informs the rage is this kind of idea when someone has Lorde-ian rage, the perspective that informs it is that they're thinking that I am not free until all of us are free, right? I am not free until all of us is free, all right? Okay. So that's the kind of rage that I want to kind of motivate today. This kind of Lorde-ian rage is aimed at racism that seeks to bring about a kind of change, a radical transformation of our world. When one has this rage, they want to try to get as much information they can get from it. They want to use it for good. And they want to get freedom, not just for oneself, but also for all right? Okay, so that's Lorde-ian rage. So let's now turn to what I mean by feeling rules, because in order for us to understand racial rules that this Lorde-ian rage breaks, I think it's important for us to do a little preview of exactly what feeling rules is all about. So I want to kind of give us 3 views of feeling rules, and then we're going to take a look and see where Lorde-ian rage fits in this, all right? So the term itself, feeling rules, comes from the work of a sociologist by the name of Arlie Russell Hochschild. And she talks about feeling rules in her 1979 work, particularly when she's talking about emotional labor, for example. And she talks about feeling rules. And this is how she describes feeling rules. She says, feeling rules are guidelines for the assessment of fits and misfits between feeling and situation. Okay, that sounds abstract. Let me just tell you what that means. Feeling rules simply tells us who should feel a certain emotion, and it also tells us when we should feel that certain emotion, all right? It tells us who should feel a certain emotion and when we should feel a certain emotion, all right? And she wants to say that every society has these feeling rules, right? Another way of saying this is that aptness or the appropriateness of emotions is taught to us. And not only are they taught to us, they are also enforced by us. So let me give you some examples of what I mean. If you've ever told yourself, I should be grateful. This is something that I often tell myself because my mother taught me this when I was younger. I should be grateful. I should be grateful. Just that thought itself is a feeling rule. It says who should feel a certain emotion, which is I. And it tells me, when should I feel this particular emotion? I should feel it now, right? Even if I don't have a lot, given what I have now, it tells me that I should be grateful, right? But remember, the feeling rule is not just something that we teach ourselves or is taught by our particular parents and we enforce it on ourselves, but it's also something that we enforce on others, and it's also something that we teach others, right? So this is an example of me telling a feeling rule to someone else. You got to learn how to be happy for her, right? If you ever told a friend this, you are teaching and enforcing a particular feeling rule, right? So perhaps this person dated somebody, and that person is now gone on to be happy, and the person professes to still love this person. Well, imagine telling your friend, why are you upset that they're happy, right? You, right, given that you love this person and you've had a close, intimate relationship with this person, you should be happy, right? It's telling who should feel the emotion and exactly when and what emotion they should feel in this particular situations, right? And Hochschild basically tells us that these feeling rules are taught to us by the media, by the news, by sitcoms. They are enforced by the law, and they're also enforced by us and enforced by parents, all right? These are our feeling rules, right? In more recent work, legal scholar Janine Young Kim introduces to what she calls the racial asymmetry of feeling rules, right? And she simply tells us, okay, yes, feeling rules exist, but here's the interesting thing. There are different rules, different feeling rules for different racialized bodies, right? There are different feeling rules for different racialized bodies. So here's an example of what I mean by this. So imagine in our particular society, she says that for a particular racialized body, let's call it a black woman, the feeling rule in our society is for that black woman to always suppress anger, right? She should suppress anger. That is the feeling rule for her particular racialized body. And then we can imagine another racialized body, let's call her an Asian woman. The feeling rule in our society that tells her when she should feel a certain emotion is to suggest that no matter what comes her way, no adversity or hardship or oppression, that she should be happy while subservient. Right? That is the feeling rule for her particular racialized body, right? And we can imagine that there may be some context in which if we were to replace this racialized body with another racialized body, there will be another feeling rule, right? So one of the things that Kim suggests, and mind you, these feeling rules are going to arise due to the kind of stereotypes and implicit bias, et cetera, and therefore the expectations that we have for certain kind of racialized bodies. But then Janine Kim says, well, what happens is that this black woman or this Asian woman can break the racial rule, right? The feeling rule, right? And she says, quote, breaking the rule, right, not suppressing anger or not being happy while subservient, she says, is a form of protest against the shame and meekness that emotion rules attempt to instill among the racialized, right? Breaking the rule, refusing to give in to the rule that has been given to them based on their racialized body, she says, is a form of protest against the shame and meekness that the emotion rule attempts to instill among the racialized body, all right? So an example of the protest that instead of the black woman suppressing the anger, if she expresses anger, instead of the Asian woman being happy while subservient, if she therefore becomes resentful at oppression, what Kim says is happening is that they are participating in what she calls an affective transgression. They are participating in an affective transgression. They are transgressing against the feeling rule that society says that they should have because of their particular racial and gendered positioning. She continues, she says, the acceptance and the valorization of the anger is an act of affective transgression. And she says that this kind of transgression is fundamental to the struggle against racism. All right? Refusing to give in to this feeling rule and transgression against the feeling rule, she says, is fundamental to the struggle against racism. All right? Keep that in mind. And then we go to the work of philosopher Alison Jagger, who in her 1989 work talk about this notion called emotion outlaw or outlaw emotions. And she says, quote from her work, within a capitalist, white suprematist, and male-dominated society, the predominant values in that society will serve the dominant group, which is rich white men. And she says, very interestingly so, that our emotional constitution will be influenced by this particular society that has these particular values. So let me give an example of what she means by that. She says, well, in a capitalist, white supremacist, patriarchal society, when a racial joke is uttered, the feeling rule in this particular society will be amusement, right? We will expect people to laugh at a racial joke, right? In a capitalist, white supremacist, patriarchal society, when misogyny occurs, which is misogyny against black women, the feeling rule, the expectation that we will have in that particular society would be indifferent to the suffering and the misogyny against black women, all right? So how do you break those particular rules? So what happens when you break that particular rule? Alison Jagger wants to suggest that when one decides to instead be resentful at a racial joke instead of being amused by it, or when one decides to extend empathy to black women instead of indifference, she wants to say that they have just participated in what she calls an outlaw emotion, right? And to summarize her view, she says, feeling the unprescribed emotion, all right, the outlaw emotion, she says is incompatible with the dominant society's values, the capitalist, patriarchal, white supremacist value and perceptions, making it unacceptable in that society to have those particular emotional reactions. Right? So in summary, so far, we know that there are particular feeling rules of exactly who should feel certain stuff and when you should feel certain stuff. The work of these scholars also lets us know that there are different feeling rules depending on how you're racially positioned in society, right? And then another thing that they show us is that when the oppressed, or the oppressed have always in some ways transgressed against certain kinds of feeling rules, and they have protested against these particular feeling rules. And some of these authors have even suggested that to do so is part of resisting racial injustice, resisting racial oppressions and expectations, right? So the question may be, now at this point, well, you just laid out feeling rules, you just told us the transgression that happens as a result of it. So what's left to say? It seems like we can just go home and get some pizza, right? So I want to say that there is more that can be said. So I want to say a little bit more. And I kind of want to improve on what I consider to be some vague recommendations, particularly how in the world does participating in such outlaw emotions is a resistance against racial injustice or a form of protest or necessary, fundamental necessary to the fight against racial injustice. So I want to kind of improve on some vagueness. And I also want to add some friendly amendments, all right? So the aim for, I guess, the next 20 minutes or so is that I want to introduce some rules, what I call racial rules, that cannot just be reduced to feelings, all right? And then another thing I want to do is to show you how, and also show you why rage, anger, is fundamental to the struggle against racial injustice. So some of you thought that, no, it's about getting on the front lines and going to be a part of that protest or sign in that petition online. But I want to say what you feel inside is a resistant act and also is fundamental to the struggle against racial injustice, all right? So let's now talk about what are racial rules, and then let's also talk about how one can break these racial rules through rage, all right? Okay, so racial rules. So you notice I said that I want to introduce some rules that can't be reduced to just feelings, right? And I want to say that racial rules, yes, they have to do with how we feel, because it's an emotion. So it is an affective rule, or another word for feelings, but it's also behavioral, right? It's a rule. Not only do we follow about what we should feel or how we should feel, but it also is a rule that tells us what we should do, behavioral. And it's also a rule that is very much cognitive. It tells us what we should believe, or what we should perceive, or what particular attitudes we should have, all right? So the racial rule is not just about feeling rules, but they include behavioral rules and also cognitive rules, all right? However, very much like feeling rules, what we'll notice is that these particular racial rules, they are taught to us. They're very much taught to us through the media, through parents, through teachers, by each other, and they're also enforced by each other, by the media, by the police. They're also enforced. So they are taught and enforced. Whether we intend to do so or whether we don't, they are taught and enforced. So I want to talk about two particular racial rules. And while I'm laying out these particular racial rules, I'm going to, in between them, or at least try to claim or explain how having rage at racial injustice, particularly Lorde-ian rage, breaks these particular racial rules, all right? So let's talk about rule number one. So rule number one is very much influenced by W.B. Du Bois in his work, particularly his work, The Souls of White Folks. So here is racial rule number one, and it goes as following. Remember whiteness and keep it holy. Remember whiteness and keep it holy. All right? So here is Du Bois in his 1920 essay, The Souls of White Folks. He says, and this is him explaining how whiteness came to be, right? Not how white people came to be, but how this notion of whiteness came to be. He says, quote, they were now white, and by that token, wonderful, all right? All right? They were now white, and by that token, wonderful, because anytime you racialize, you ascribe value to that racialized category. So they were now white, racialized, and they were wonderful. So they were given a kind of value to this whiteness. This wonderfulness, they believe, granted them certain entitlements. So not only does one become wonderful, but one is entitled to certain things. And he says the right to ownership of the earth. So given that one has whiteness and one is wonderful, one is entitled to the earth and all kinds of expansion of the earth. And he says forever and ever, amen. He also continues the essay that it's not just entitlement to the land, but to the peoples that live on the land, hence the colonization process, et cetera, et cetera. Okay. So what is the cognitive rule and the racial rule, number one? Remember whiteness and keep it holy. So the cognitive rule of this particular racial rule says that what we ought to do, what we ought to believe, the attitude and the belief that we ought to have is to accept that everything that is great is white. To accept that everything that is great is white. All right? So there's no need to teach any people of color. There's no need to teach any Native American history because the only great history or great contribution has come through white Western history. All right? That's the cognitive rule. Accept that everything that is great is white. Okay? So here's the question. How does having Lorde-ian rage that I have described, how does that break this particular rule? So one of the things I wanna claim of how it breaks this particular rule, when one has this Lorde-ian rage, how does it break this cognitive rule? Well, the first thing that it does is that Lorde-ian rage, when it arises as a result of racism, right, and racism's kind of call or at least claim to white superiority, Lorde-ian rage is responding to this claim of superiority, and it basically rejects a claim to this kind of specialness based on race. Because it's arising through racism, which is based on white superiority, right? So Lorde-ian rage, it arises, and when it arises in a particular agent and a particular individual, it's rejecting claims to any one race being special. It rejects claims to any particular race being wonderful and all other races not being wonderful, right? It rejects claims to specialness, right? That's why it's there, right? It detects that even this claim is inaccurate. It is morally wrong, right? So it rejects claims to this kinds of specialness, right? But there is also not only a cognitive rule to racial rule number one, but it's also a behavioral rule to racial rule number one. And the behavioral rule, what it tells us that we should not only feel, but also do, it tells us that we ought to endorse whiteness's right to possess, right? So you kind of think about this. So if we live in this particular society that we live in, and you accept, for example, that racial rule number one exists in the world, how is this behavioral rule lived out? And I want to suggest that it's not just white people who follow this racial rule, right? The racial rule, behavioral rule, says that everyone ought to endorse whiteness' right to possess, right? So you all heard of the term, and I think this has become a buzzword, the notion of white privilege, right? You got to think about, so we know that the recipients of white privilege is white folks, but then you have to ask yourself, well, who is endorsing it? Right? And as we kind of look at any kind of critical white studies or critical race theory, what you'll find out is that it's not just white people granting white people privilege, right? But also black people are taught to privilege white people, right? And brown people are taught to privilege white people, right? To give whiteness their right or their entitlement, right? So it's something that all of us can be complicit in. This is the behavioral rule, right? It tells everyone ought to grant whiteness as their right to possess, their right to have certain things, their right to have certain jobs or certain kind of school admissions, et cetera, based on color alone. That's the behavioral rule. So then the question comes in, well, how is it that having Lorde-ian rage breaks this behavioral rule, right? So one of the things that Lorde-ian rage does, it challenges this particular right, right? And this is very much, you notice that the way in which it breaks these racial rules and each kind of aspect of the feeling rule is very much connected to each other, right? It challenges this right. Right? It says not only is there's no claim to specialness of whiteness, but there's also no claim to whiteness's right to possess. Now, W. Du Bois has a better way of saying this. He says in that essay, he says, when the black man begins to dispute the white man's entitlement, to certain alleged bequests of the fathers in wage and possession, authority in training, and when his attitude toward charity is anger rather than jollity, then the spell is suddenly broken and the philanthropist is ready to believe that Negroes are impudent. All right, I know this is a very fancy way of writing. I wish I could write this way. It's also very difficult to understand. What is Du Bois saying here? He's basically saying, listen, the racial rule, as long as you're given in to this racial rule of granting white people the right to possess everything, right? You are respected. You are looked at as going according to the racial rule, so you are a good black person or a good brown person. But when you decide to respond to that entitlement, refuse to behave according to that racial rule, then there's certain kind of perceptions or certain kind of ways in which whiteness will look at or perceive that particular individual because they recognize that one is breaking that particular rule. So this leads us to the feeling rule, or at least the affective rule of racial rule number 1, which simply says that in response to oppression, in response to racial superiority, how ought people to feel? How ought particularly oppressed people to feel? And the affective rule is, well, you should not cry and you should not be angry. And the affective rule is just for one to be brave, right? Just be courageous in one's oppressed situation, right? That is the feeling rule in this particular context of racial superiority. Let's continue with Du Bois. He says, and this is a white gentleman telling him this, quote, "Weep not, nor rage," so don't cry, don't get angry. "I know too well that the curse of God lies heavy on you as a black person. Why? That is not for me to say." And then the person tells him, just be courageous. Do your work in your lowly sphere, right? Just pray that the good Lord, that into heaven alone, where all is love, you may one day be born white, right? So the white man is just saying, listen, I know you are oppressed, but don't cry about it. Do not get angry. I don't know why God has made you into a black man on this earth to be cursed, but just continue to be courageous no matter what kind of oppression comes your way. And if you keep doing a good job here on earth, maybe one day you will get the gift of being born white, all right? So the question is, how does Lorde-ian rage break this particular behavioral rule or affective rule? And one of the things that Lorde-ian rage decides to do is that it resists this recommendation, right? Remember, the recommendation is not to be angry. Just accept your oppression. And Lorde-ian rage says, nah, I'm not going to do that. All right. Remember going back to Lord's quote, my response to racism is rage, right? It's not simply courage or being silent. My response is rage, right? It resists the recommendation to feel a certain kind of way in society. So then the question is, so why is this important? We have racial rule number 1, and you're telling me that I can resist Lorde-ian rage through the ways in which I have described. I can resist rage, break this racial rule number 1. Why is this important? So one of the reasons why I think that it is important is that I think white supremacy depends on this rule. Remember, rule number 1 is remember whiteness and keep it holy. All right? White supremacy depends on this rule. And one of the things that I think what is important about Lorde-ian rage, that when Lorde-ian rage arises as a result of this racial rule, it rejects white supremacy claims and its logics, right? Making it a powerful way to resist racial oppression, right? It causes us to resist racial oppression, and not only resist racial oppression in ways in which we stereotypically think it occurs, but it also forces us to resist it in the very cognitive, emotional, and behavior implicit ways that it seeks to control us as well. Okay. All right. So let's go to racial rule number 2. So racial rule number 2 is not necessarily inspired by any particular figure. It is inspired by history, and this is the rule. So racial rule number 2 says, thou shalt not have a right to white male anger. Thou shalt not have a right to white male anger. So in order to understand this particular rule, I must allow you to see the connection between value, respect, and anger, all right? And this is work that was done by Aristotle, has been done by work by Robin Dillon and philosophers Geoffrey Murphy. So here's the connection between the three, right? That if you consider anything to be valuable, whether that is a person or a thing, if someone mistreats that thing that you consider valuable, then that would be cause for reasons to think that that thing has been disrespected, right? So if you think that you are valuable and someone mistreats you, then you have every reason, because you think that you are valuable, to feel that you have been disrespected. And if you feel that you have been disrespected, then there will be justifiable reasons why one will be angry at the mistreatment, right? Because there's a connection between value, disrespect, and anger, right? So much so that if you value your car, right, let's just say that you have a BMW, and someone decides to ram into that BMW because you consider that thing to be valuable, you will feel that you just got disrespected, or your car got disrespected, and therefore there will be reasons why you will be angry, right? Because something was mistreated about something that you value, right? Because there's a connection between value, respect, and anger. However, if you do not think that something has value, then when that thing or that person is mistreated, you will not think that that person or that thing has any claim to respect. And if you think that that person or that thing has no claims to respect, then you will see no reason why in the world that they would ever get angry at such treatment, right? Because there's a connection between value, respect, and anger. So let's briefly look at history. So in 19th century Europe particularly, what we know is that and there's been history done on the history of anger, for example, through ancient up into our times. And that time period is interesting because it was the case that anger was the right only of men, right? It was not the right of women, right? So when a woman was violated, because she was the property of a man or a nation, right, her value was tied up not in herself, but her value was only tied up into the man and the state in which was the owner of her, right? So if she was violated, she had no claims to disrespect or to value. Her husband, because he was her proprietor, had claims to her value. Therefore, when she was violated, he was disrespected. It was the man who was disrespected. So if you hit my girl, you disrespected me, right? And because his value or her value was inherently found in him, because he was disrespected, he had a claim to anger, right? He could be angry, and therefore what you have is the duel, right? But her violation was tied up in him, right? And she had no claims to disrespect or claims to anger. He had the claims to disrespect and to anger, right? Because she had no value, she had no claims to respect, she had no claim to anger. Only a man had claim to value. Only he was valuable, and therefore, if he was mistreated, he could say that he was disrespected, and therefore his anger would be justified. And it's not surprisingly that still exists today. That rule, that anger is the right of white men, because they are inherently, or at least in a white supremacist, capitalist, patriarchal society, men are inherently valuable. White men are inherently valuable. And when they are mistreated, then they can say that they have claims to respect. And because they can say that they have been disrespected given this particular value, then we can see, justifiably so, why they would have a right to anger. All right? Then you contrast this to some other cases, and I'm going to try to present this to you, and we'll see kind of the opposite end of the spectrum. So let's contrast this with black women. So Serena Williams, some might think that Serena Williams has no inherent value, other than the capitalistic value that she gives to tennis, right? As a black woman, but she has no claims to value because she's not inherently valuable. And if she's not inherently valuable, then no matter what kind of calls, racist calls or racist things that are done on the court in relationship to her or unfair calls, she has not been disrespected, right? And if she's have not been disrespected given her value, then we might say that she has no claim to anger, right? So when she displays anger, what she's really displaying is unsportsmanship-like conduct, right? Or she's just being an angry black woman, right? But because she has no inherent value, she has no claim to disrespect no matter how much she is mistreated, and therefore people will be puzzled to why in the hell she would be angry, right? And then we'll look at the life of Sandra Bland. For those who do not know, Sandra Bland was a woman who was traveling through the state of Texas. She was pulled over by a police officer, I guess because she refused to, switch a light or some sort of traffic violation. When a police officer stopped her, she was smoking. He asked her to put the cigarette out. She refused. He asked her to come out the car. She refused. When he got her out the car, as we can see through the video, there was a tussle that occurred, and a couple of days later, she was found dead in her cell. If you watch that video, some people would say, probably not admit this, but may think it, that she has no inherent value, right, being a black woman in this particular society. And because she has no inherent value, then she has no claims to disrespect, right? That encounter is not a disrespectful encounter. And if she has no claim to disrespect, then people might wonder, although the police officer, physically mishandled her, then they would not understand why in the world that she would be angry in response to his mistreatment of her, right? And we can continue this with more examples. Take, for instance, Anita Hill. And Anita Hill got some repopularity for those who were not born or just born during this time period, during the Clarence Thomas hearing. And her case was contrasted more recently with Dr. Ford's testimony in the Congress hearing. But one of the things that was being said about Anita Hill, for example, is that, listen, she had no inherent value, just a black woman, and this was said on both aisles of the racial divide, that particularly in comparison to a promising black man, she had no inherent value. So no matter what was happening in the workplace, she had no claims to disrespect, and if she has no claims to disrespect, then we will wonder why in the hell she was angry at her treatment of sexual harassment, all right? So let's now move from the examples of black women and go to a black man, particularly talking in the context of class. So, it's interesting when you provide examples of something, and then you encounter examples that really embodies what you're trying to say, and it gets kind of scary, particularly given the work that I do. Now, remember the connection between value, respect, and anger. So in Michael Brown, individual who was a young black man who was shot in Ferguson, Missouri by police officer Darren Wilson. Unfortunately, there's no video of the encounter, but there is a testimony, a report by Darren Wilson of exactly what happened. And I want to read this, and I want you all to see the connection between what I've just laid out. So this is Darren Wilson explaining the encounter with Mike Brown. He says, he looked up, this is Darren Wilson saying what Mike Brown did, he looked up at me and had the most intense, aggressive face. The only way I can describe it, it looks like a demon. That's how angry Mike Brown looked. He was almost bulking up to run through the shots. This is Mike Brown shooting at him. Like it was making him mad that I'm shooting him, right? But if you have no value, particularly in this capitalistic white supremacist society, then no matter how many times a police officer is shooting at you, you will have no claims to disrespect. And if you have no claims to any kind of respect, then even when someone is shooting at your body, they will be perplexed to why in the world you are angry with them. All right, so what are the different aspects of this racial rule? So the cognitive, or the rule of how you ought to think or what you ought to believe, of racial rule number 2, that rages the right of white men, is that you ought to accept the lack of value of other lives, right? You ought to accept that black lives do not matter. You ought to accept that Muslim lives do not matter. You ought to accept that women lives do not matter. That's what you ought to accept. The only lives that matter in the world is rich white men. So how do you break this rule when you respond to certain kinds of injustices with Lorde-ian rage? Lorde-ian rage doesn't accept this message. It refused to accept that some lives are more valuable than others, right? And if you're interested more on this connection, there's work in the anthology that was edited by a brilliant person by the name of Myisha. And there's an essay in that edited volume where a person argues about how anger is an act of valuing, right? And if you want to go into more detail about this, right? So Lorde-ian rage doesn't accept this message, right? It values all lives in so much that it's responding, the rage is in response. Remember the connection between value, respect, and anger. The rage arises due to the mistreatment of lives that some people say do not value. It's not valuable in this particular society. It refuses to accept that only some lives have any kind of value, all right? So what is the behavioral rule? What does rule number 2 tell us to do in the world, right? It tells us, particularly some lives, don't act respectful. Don't act like your life is valuable, and don't demand respect. And if you demand respect, which is demanding or making claims that your life is valuable, then you will be punished, right? That's what this behavioral rule tells us, right? So how does Lorde-ian rage break this particular rule? It says, you know what? I'm going to exist despite the risk, right? So someone that I call a renegade rager, this is someone who is angry at the mistreatment of others, let's say a white person who has Lorde-ian rage, right, is willing to take the risk that some white people may think you're a race traitor, for example, right? A particular person who has been, who is scared to think that they're fulfilling the stereotype of an angry black woman. Lorde-ian rage says, you know what, you can think that all you want. But my anger, if a life is not being respected, I'm still going to be angry. I'm still going to have Lorde-ian rage. It's willing to take the risk of being punished despite, the repercussions, right? And then last but not least, very similar to rule number 1, the feeling rule of racial rule number 2 tells us suppress the anger. So even if you are angry, just don't express it, right? Even if you're angry, do not express it. And the ways in which Lorde-ian rage breaks this rule and says, nah, we're going to express it, right? We refuse to allow rule number 2 that tells us that we ought not to have anger on behalf of the oppression of other people. And this is going back to Audre Lorde's quote. She says, my response to racism is anger. That anger has eaten clefts into my living only, so it's only done destruction. It's only been unproductive. It's only been harmful when I did not express it. Right? But she says, I want to express it. It's a response to racism. It must speak, right? So it disobeys that affective rule and decides that it wants to be expressed as opposed to repress, right? Now, we can talk a little bit more about expressions if you have any questions in the Q&A. But some people might think that expression always takes place in front of a large audience. It must take place in front of a crowd. But I've been thinking, I don't know how many of y'all remember the Key and Peele sketch. Some of you do, with Obama. And you notice that the person who's standing, anybody remember the name? Luther, Obama's anger translator, right? And I think what was so brilliant about this skit is that a lot of people thought, and think about it, like Obama faced a lot of stuff. Right? Whether it's the congressman that stood up and said, you lie, whether it's the racist newspapers and depictions and cartoon depictions of Michelle Obama, for example, right? The Obama administration, they felt some racism, right? What Obama is usually known for is about how cool he was, right? And I think what was so brilliant about this skit, they says, well, yes, he didn't express it the way a lot of us would express it, but don't doubt it. It was always there. Right? And there's no doubt, I don't want to say, this has a lot to do with strategy, right? I think one can be strategic in how they express their rage. But just because we didn't see it from Obama doesn't necessarily mean that he suppressed it, right? And I think this skit lets us know that it was there. And there's no doubt, I'm a firm believer that he expressed it to Michelle. He expressed it to other people. But I think what I'm claiming here is that expression need not always to be over a microphone or in front of a bullhorn, that there's other ways in which we can express. And sometimes expression is a strategic act. But just because we don't see it doesn't necessarily mean that it's there. And I think it was always there. And he was able to have Lorde-ian rage and broke some racial rules. Right? So why is this important? Why is breaking the racial rule in this way important? Well, I think rule number 2, it seeks to control us. It controls the way in which we respond and act in the world and what we value in the world. It seeks to exude certain power over us as individuals, right? And I think what's powerful about Lorde-ian rage is that it reaffirms lives that our society says should not be affirmed. And it takes, in a way, as a result of that, it takes back that particular power, right? Okay, so what are the upshots of everything that I've had to say so far? Right? So one of the things I think my view does, or what my argument does, that it explains how rage challenges racial domination and why it's necessary, right? In ways in which, as I talked about in the first beginning of this talk, kind of left more questions than answers. So I think my argument so far explains how rage challenges racial domination, and it does it by resisting these particular rules, by refusing to act and to feel and to behave in a particular society. I also think it explains why, in a lot of ways, why a lot of people are scared of anger at racial injustice, right? and why people consider it as a threat, and why people insincerely criticize it and misunderstands it, because they also know that when one has it, they are breaking racial rules as well. All right. So you notice at the beginning of this talk, I kind of talked about the features of a resistance figure, and I talked about they risk their lives and they speak truth to power and they go against the status quo and they protest. One of the things I want to say, all of this is found in what I've just been articulating, right? So one doesn't need to necessarily get on a football field and bend a knee or to get over the microphone to be a resistance figure. That when one has Lorde-ian rage and they're breaking these racial rules, all these things are also happening at the same time, right? And because this is the case, right, because one doesn't need a large following, or one doesn't actually need to join a protest, not to say that there's no value in that. In my book, I kind of talk about how one can do that. But because just by having it, one breaks the racial rules, then I think this explains why there are a lot of resistance figures among us, even in this particular room. All right. So I want to highlight the work of Ida B. Wells. All right. She was a resistant figure who had Lorde-ian rage. The work of Sojourner Truth. She was a resistant figure that had Lorde-ian rage. And our grandmothers and our mothers are resistant figures, particularly if they had Lorde-ian rage. And this also explains, for me, not only why there have always been resistance figure among us historically that we know of, but I think there are young people around this country who also is responding to injustices, Lorde-ian rage. And as a result, I think they are resistance figure. You may not know them by name, but they are resistance figure. So here are some things I want us to think about. If this is the case, that there are resistance figures among us who have Lorde-ian rage, and by having the Lorde-ian rage, they are breaking racial rules and resisting racial domination as a result, I think they should be praised, right? So as opposed to telling somebody, calm down, praise them for their rage. I think they should be encouraged and suppressed. So as opposed to discouraging them and telling them to go along to get along, I think they should be encouraged and supported. And because with that rage, they are breaking racial rules, we have every right to be afraid of them because of what they're doing. Thank you.